The evening was calm in the city, and the lights of the upscale restaurant glowed warmly through the glass windows. Inside, the air was filled with the sound of soft music, the gentle clink of silverware, and the murmur of conversations. Guests, dressed in elegant suits and dresses, sat at polished wooden tables. Enjoying the atmosphere, the staff moved quickly but gracefully. Their steps trained to be quiet, their smiles polite. Everything looked perfect. Then the doors opened, and in walked the billionaire. His presence was like a sudden wave that changed the mood instantly. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his shoes shining. His wrist carried a watch worth more than most people's yearly salary. The guests noticed him immediately. Some whispered his name. Others turned their heads discreetly. The staff at the front straightened their backs nervously. Everyone knew who he was. The billionaire carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. His chin high, his eyes sharp. He didn't glance around the room as a normal guest would. He walked as though he owned the very place. The manager hurried forward, almost running to greet him, bowing slightly and welcoming him with words of honor. "Yes, yes," the billionaire muttered, his tone impatient. He didn't bother to smile or shake hands. He expected respect, not warmth. His eyes swept over the restaurant, and without asking, he pointed to a large table near the center. "That one," he said. His voice was commanding. The manager quickly nodded and guided him to the seat. Guests watched with curiosity. Some admired his wealth. Others frowned at his arrogance. The staff whispered quietly behind the counter. They all knew this was going to be a difficult evening. Serving him was like walking on glass. You had to be careful, or you'd cut yourself. At the far end of the room, a waitress adjusted her apron. She was a young black woman, hardworking and calm. Her name badge shone under the lights. She had been working at the restaurant for years, known among the staff for her patience and quiet strength. She carried trays with grace, always polite, always respectful. The manager looked around for someone to serve the billionaire. His eyes landed on her. "You," he said. "Take care of our special guest. Do not make mistakes." His tone was sharp, as if warning her. She nodded softly, her face showing no fear. She had served all kinds of guests, kind ones, rude ones, rich ones, poor ones. She knew her duty, and she carried it with dignity. The billionaire sat at his chosen table, crossing his legs, tapping his fingers against the surface as though time itself was beneath him. He leaned back in his chair, scanning the room. His eyes demanded attention, but no one dared to stare. Too long, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The soft calmness of the restaurant now felt heavy, filled with tension. The waitress picked up her notepad and approached, her steps steady, her voice gentle as she greeted him. "Good evening. Sir, welcome to our restaurant. How may I serve you tonight?" But the billionaire barely looked at her. His eyes flicked up and down, as if he was inspecting her. His lips curled slightly. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he snapped his fingers sharply, as though calling for a servant a few nearby. Guests frowned at the sound, but they said nothing. Finally, he spoke, his tone cold. "Bring me a menu. Not please, not thank you, only a command." The waitress nodded politely. "Of course, sir." She handed him the menu with both hands, respectful as always. He snatched it quickly. Not even glancing at her, the guests nearby watched quietly. Already sensing the arrogance in his behavior, the waitress, however, remained calm, her face neutral, her voice steady. She was trained for this. She had seen such attitudes before. The billionaire scanned the menu, muttering under his breath about prices, about choices, as if nothing was good enough for him. He sighed loudly, tapping his fingers impatiently. "Why is this taking so long?" he asked, though no one had delayed him. His voice carried across the room, and a few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress stood patiently, waiting for him to decide, her posture respectful. her hands folded gently in front. Of her, she did not rush him, did not show frustration. She simply waited. The guests nearby admired her composure, though none dared to speak. Finally, the billionaire tossed the menu onto the table. "I'll take the steak, medium rare, and make it quick. I don't have all night." His tone was harsh, but the waitress nodded with the same gentle smile. "Yes, sir, right away," she replied. She wrote it down neatly, turned, and walked calmly toward the kitchen. As she left, the billionaire leaned back again, smirking faintly. His eyes scanned the room, pleased with himself. He didn't notice the whispers of the guests or the tension in the staff's faces. To him, this was just another evening where he was the center of the world. But the waitress, as she handed the order to the chef, took a quiet breath. She had felt the weight of his arrogance, the sharpness of his tone, yet she carried herself with the same dignity as always. She did not let his behavior shake her calmness. The evening had only just begun, and already the air was thick with tension. The billionaire's presence was like a storm cloud hanging over the restaurant, and everyone, staff and guests alike, could feel it. What no one knew was that before the night ended, the same man who walked in with arrogance and shouted with power would be silenced by a single sentence, spoken calmly by the very woman he thought he could humiliate. The billionaire sat at his table, already making the room feel smaller with his presence. His sharp voice and snapping fingers had drawn stares. And though the guests returned to their meals, the tension in the air never left. The staff moved quickly, stealing nervous glances toward him, no one eager to be the one standing at his side too long. Behind the counter, the manager watched closely. His eyes darted from the billionaire to his staff. He knew that serving such a powerful man was risky. One wrong move could mean complaints, embarrassment, or worse. The manager thought carefully. Then his eyes landed on her. The black waitress was moving gracefully between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease. Her posture was straight, her steps careful. She placed glasses of water down, smiled politely at the guests, and picked up empty dishes without a single sound, unlike some of the newer staff. She never rushed, never stumbled. Her calmness was her strength. The manager called her name sharply. She looked up instantly, her expression respectful. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. The manager pointed toward the billionaire's table. "You'll serve him, and listen carefully. Don't upset him. Do you understand?" She nodded, her face steady. "Yes, sir," she replied. Her voice carried no fear, though deep inside she knew this task would not be easy. She had served arrogant guests before, but something about this man felt different. He was louder, sharper, colder, yet she adjusted her apron and walked toward his table without hesitation. The billionaire sat back in his chair, one hand resting on his expensive watch, the other tapping on the polished table. His eyes flicked toward her as she approached, but he didn't smile, didn't greet her. He simply looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of furniture, useful but unimportant. "Good evening, sir," she said politely, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll be taking care of your table tonight. May I start you off with a drink?" The billionaire didn't respond right away. Instead, he raised his eyebrows slightly, as if questioning why she was speaking at all. Then he waved his hand. "Water, bottled, cold," he said. His tone was clipped, demanding, as though she should have known already. She nodded. "Of course, sir," right away, and turned to fetch it. Her movements were quick but calm. She placed the bottle on a tray, returned, and set it gently in front of him. The billionaire barely glanced at her, twisting the cap open without a word of thanks at the nearby tables. A few guests watched quietly. They had already noticed his behavior, the way his voice cut through the air like a knife. But what struck them more was the way the waitress carried herself. She showed no irritation, no frown. Her face remained calm, her dignity unshaken. As the evening went on, she returned to his table again and again, each time greeted not with kindness, but with impatience. He tapped the table when he wanted something, snapped his fingers when he thought she was too slow. At one point, he muttered under his breath, "Service here is too slow." Though she had been moving faster than anyone else in the room, still, she remained composed. "Yes, sir," she answered softly each time, writing down his order neatly, making sure not to spill a drop when she poured his wine. Her patience was like a shield protecting her from the sting of his arrogance. Other waiters whispered to each other behind the counter, "I couldn't handle that." One said, "He'd drive me crazy." Another shook her head, "She's stronger than all of us. Look how calm she stays." They admired her quietly. Though they never said it out loud, the billionaire noticed none of this. To him, she was invisible except when he needed something. And when he needed something, he expected it immediately when she brought his appetizer. He waved his hand dismissively. "Too slow," he muttered, even though it had only been a few minutes. She placed the plate gently on the table and replied calmly, "I'll make sure everything else is faster, sir." Her tone wasn't submissive, was professional. She chose her words carefully, never letting his insults pull her down. Guests at the surrounding tables exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, whispering about how rude he was. One man muttered quietly, "If that were me, I'd have walked away already." But they could see the waitress wasn't like them. She didn't just work for a paycheck, she worked with pride. As she walked back toward the kitchen, the manager stopped her, whispering sharply, "Make sure he doesn't complain. Do you hear me? He's important." She nodded again, "Yes, sir," but in her heart, she wondered why people like him were treated as if they owned the world. The billionaire, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, satisfied with himself. He believed he was in control, believed that his wealth gave him the right to speak however he wanted. But what he didn't know was that the same woman he dismissed and disrespected would soon shatter his arrogance with a single sentence. For now, though, the stage was set. The waitress moved calmly between tables, never raising her voice, never lowering her dignity. She was patient, composed, and unshaken. While the billionaire grew louder with each demand, her silence was her strength. And as the night stretched on, the other guests began to feel it too. They saw the contrast, his arrogance against her grace, his shouting against her quiet dignity. The room was slowly building toward something, a clash no one expected, but everyone would remember. The restaurant glowed softly under its chandeliers. The music played low. Guests murmured quietly. But the calm atmosphere had a shadow over it. The billionaire seated at the center. His sharp movements, his snapping fingers, and his cold stares made everyone nervous. It was as if the whole room waited for the next thing he would say. The waitress returned with his order, balancing the tray with careful hands. She placed the steak in front of him with precision, bowing her head slightly. "Your steak, sir," she said gently. Her tone was warm, professional, practiced. But the billionaire leaned forward, staring at the plate as if he had been insulted. He picked up his fork and knife, cut a small piece, chewed slowly, and then scowled. "This is not medium rare," he snapped. His voice was sharp, carrying across the tables. Heads turned instantly. Forks froze mid-air. The waitress kept her expression calm. "I'll take it back and have it corrected right away, sir," she said softly, reaching to remove the plate, but the billionaire pulled it back, his eyes narrowing. "Are you deaf? I said it's not medium rare. Do you even know how to do your job?" The words stung in the air, cruel and unnecessary. A few nearby guests exchanged shocked looks. A woman covered her mouth, whispering that was uncalled for. Another man shook his head. He didn't have to say it like that. The waitress kept her hands steady. "I understand, sir. I'll fix it," she replied, her voice even. her face calm, but inside, her chest tightened. She had dealt with rude customers before, but the sheer arrogance in his tone made the room feel heavy. The billionaire leaned back, waving his hand dismissively. "Just bring it back and don't waste my time again," he barked. His voice rose higher than it needed to, loud enough, so the whole room could hear. He wanted them to hear. He wanted everyone to know that he was powerful, that even in a fine restaurant, he could humiliate someone and no one would stop him. The waitress carried the plate back to the kitchen. Her step steady, she placed it down for the chef to adjust, then stood quietly for a moment, taking a slow breath. She wouldn't let his words break her. Not here, not in front of all those eyes. Her dignity was stronger than his shouting. When she returned with the corrected meal, she placed it in front of him with the same grace as before. "Here you are, sir, fresh and prepared as you requested." The billionaire cut another piece, chewed, and gave a slight nod. "Better," he muttered, but then his eyes snapped up to hers. "Next time, don't make me repeat myself. I don't like repeating myself, understand?" The waitress nodded, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Yes, sir." Nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Some clenched their jaws, others whispered under their breath. One woman muttered, "She's handling this better than anyone could. I'd have walked away." Another replied softly, "She's stronger than he thinks." But the billionaire wasn't finished. As the evening went on, he found new ways to show his arrogance. When his water glass was half empty, he tapped it loudly against the table until she came. When she arrived, he muttered, "Finally," as though she had kept him waiting hours. When he dropped his napkin, he didn't pick it up. He pointed at it and said coldly, "Get that," as though she were not a person, but a servant without value. Each time, the waitress bent down, picked it up, refilled his glass, and answered politely. She never raised her voice, never let her expression break. Her strength was in her patience, in the quiet power of not reacting. The guests, however, grew more uncomfortable with every insult. The air around the table grew thick with tension. People stopped laughing as much, stopped enjoying their meals. They watched quietly, their hearts sinking as the billionaire continued to treat her with cruelty. At one point, when she placed his dessert in front of him, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You know, for someone who works in such a fine place, you're not very impressive." His words cut sharp, the tone designed to humiliate. The waitress froze for only half a second, then straightened, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "Is there anything else I can bring you, sir?" she asked politely. The billionaire smirked, as though he had won something. As though her patience was weakness, he didn't realize that everyone else in the room saw the truth. They saw a man with money but no manners, and a woman with little power but unshakable dignity. A couple at a nearby table whispered, "He thinks he's in control. But she's the strong one here." The husband nodded. "Money can't buy respect. Look at him, he's making himself look small." But the billionaire didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. He enjoyed the sound of his own voice too much, enjoyed the feeling of control. His shouts, his arrogance, his dismissive gestures, they were only the beginning. He believed he was untouchable. The waitress, however, felt something building inside her. She had taken insult after insult, not because she was weak, but because she understood something he didn't. Patience is not silence forever. She was waiting, she was watching. She knew that sometimes the strongest reply is the one saved. For the right moment, the evening pressed on, and the billionaire grew louder, more impatient. His arrogance filled the restaurant like smoke, choking the joy out of the air. The guests waited quietly, wondering how long the waitress could endure it, wondering if she would finally snap. What no one knew, not the billionaire, not the guests, not even the manager, was that the moment was coming soon. The moment when the quiet dignity of the waitress would collide with the arrogance of the billionaire. And in that clash, a single sentence would silence the room. The restaurant's atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. The soft glow of chandeliers still lit the room. The music still played in the background, but the mood had shifted. Guests who once chatted freely now spoke in hushed tones. Their eyes kept drifting toward the billionaire's table. Everyone could sense something was building. The billionaire sat with his chest puffed out, his fork clinking loudly against his plate. Each movement was sharp, deliberate, demanding attention. He wasn't eating his meal anymore. He was performing his dominance, snapping fingers when he wanted water, sighing loudly when a dish took longer than 2 minutes. The waitress, calm as ever, continued her work. She placed plates gently, refilled glasses with quiet grace. Her patience was endless, but even patience has its limits. The guests noticed her composure, admired it, even whispered among themselves, "She's stronger than he is. Look at her calmness." But the billionaire only saw silence as weakness. Then it happened. The spark that lit the fire. The billionaire lifted his steak knife and cut into the meat. His brows furrowed, his lips tightened. He chewed slowly, then dropped the fork onto the plate with a loud clatter. "Unacceptable," he snapped. His voice carried across the room, his face flushed with irritation. The waitress approached, her voice gentle. "Is something wrong with your meal, sir?" The billionaire slammed his palm flat on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Glasses rattled. Guests gasped. "Something wrong?" he shouted, his voice booming. "Everything is wrong. Do you people even know what service means?" The room froze. Every head turned toward him. Forks and knives stopped mid-air. The music continued faintly, but no one heard it anymore. All that filled the air was the sharpness of his voice. The waitress stood firm, her hands folded neatly. In front of her, her face calm. "I apologize, sir. I'll have it corrected immediately," she said softly. But her calmness only enraged him further. He leaned forward, his eyes flashing with arrogance. His voice rose even louder. "Don't stand there pretending to care. You people never get anything right. Do you think I come here to be treated like this? I could buy this whole place and fire every single one of you." Gasps spread across the restaurant. Guests exchanged horrified looks. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "Did he just say that?" A man shook his head. "Disgraceful." Still, the waitress didn't flinch. She nodded respectfully, her voice steady. "I'll speak to the chef right away, sir." But the billionaire wasn't done. His voice thundered again. Pathetic service. Slow, careless, untrained, and you. He jabbed a finger toward her chest, his tone dripping with contempt. "You stand here acting calm, as if you're better than me. You are nothing but a waitress. Do you hear me? Nothing?" The words hung in the air like poison, cutting through the room. Guests froze. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others clenched their fists in anger. The staff behind the counter lowered their heads. Ashamed, embarrassed, the manager, standing in the corner, looked torn. His eyes darted nervously between the billionaire and the waitress. He wanted to step in, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. Fear of losing a powerful client. Fear of complaints. Fear of consequences. But the waitress remained calm. Her chest rose and fell slowly. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, steady and unshaken. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. Back, her silence at that moment was louder than any shout. The billionaire mistook it for weakness again. He leaned back, smirking as though he had won. His voice dripped with mockery. "What? Nothing to say." "That's what I thought. You people never do." The restaurant was silent. The only sound was the faint clinking of a spoon somewhere at the far end. Guests sat frozen, their eyes locked on the scene. Their hearts raced not out of fear, for themselves, but for the waitress, they expected her to break, to cry, to walk away. But she didn't. She took a slow breath, her posture still graceful, her dignity still intact. Inside, her heart pounded, but her spirit remained strong. She had faced arrogance before. She had faced humiliation. But she knew something the billionaire didn't anger. Makes noise, but dignity makes silence powerful. The billionaire smirked again. Leaning back in his chair, satisfied with himself, he believed he had crushed her spirit in front of everyone. He believed his money had once again made him untouchable. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the silence would soon break. And when it did, it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be long. It would be one simple sentence. A sentence so sharp and true that it would cut through his arrogance and leave him speechless. The guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting. Between the waitress and the billionaire, they waited, their hearts pounding. They could feel it, too. Something was coming. The outburst had shaken the room. His words had burned the air. But the waitress's reply was still to come, and when it arrived, it would turn the entire restaurant upside down. Asterisk, the billionaire's voice still echoed in the restaurant long after he had finished shouting. His words, cruel, sharp, and dripping, with arrogance, seemed to hang in the air like smoke after a fire. The clatter of plates, the gentle music, the hum of conversation, all of it had disappeared. The restaurant was frozen, locked in a silence so heavy that even breathing felt loud. The waitress stood there, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her posture straight, her face steady. She did not tremble, she did not cry. She stood as if carved from stone, unshaken by the storm of insults thrown at her. Her silence was not weakness, it was strength, the kind of strength that unsettled everyone watching. Around the room, guests stared, some wide-eyed, some with jaws clenched. Couples exchanged looks of disbelief. A mother at one table pulled her child close, shielding young ears from the billionaire's cruel words. A man in the corner whispered under his breath, "Unbelievable." But even his voice was swallowed quickly by the silence. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his smirk spreading. He believed he had won. He thought his shouting had crushed her dignity. His arrogance swelled with the quiet. Mistaking it for submission, he tapped his fingers loudly on the table, as if daring someone to challenge him. His eyes glinted with pride. But the silence was not his victory, it was hers. The waitress took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling gently. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, their gazes locked. His filled with arrogance, hers with calm fire. The billionaire shifted slightly, just for a second, as though something in her steady eyes unsettled him. The staff in the background stood frozen, waiters with trays in hand, chefs peeking nervously from the kitchen doorway. Even the manager at the corner with sweat gathering on his brow, they all waited. No one dared move, no one dared speak. The air was too thick, too heavy. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. Holding their breath, they were waiting for something, anything, for the silence to break. Some expected her to cry. Others thought she might run. A few believed she would snap back, but she didn't, not yet. The seconds stretched painfully long. Every tick of the wall clock sounded like thunder. Every shuffle of a chair felt deafening, and still, the waitress stood firm. The billionaire scoffed loudly, breaking the quiet. "That's what I thought," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Nothing to say, because you have nothing. No voice, no power, just silence." His laughter followed, sharp and ugly. But the laughter didn't spread. No one joined him. Not a single guest smiled. Instead, his words fell into the silence like stones sinking into deep water. And with each stone, his arrogance only made the room colder. The waitress let him laugh. She let him fill the air with noise. And then, when he finally leaned back, smug and satisfied, She straightened her shoulders and prepared to speak. The guests felt it before it happened. Their eyes widened. Their hearts beat faster. Something was coming. They could see it in her calmness, in the way her lips pressed together before parting, in the way her eyes held steady, as if she already knew the effect her words would have. The billionaire didn't notice. He still believed he owned the moment. He still believed money gave him power over silence. He sipped his water with a satisfied smirk, waiting for her to stumble, waiting for her to retreat. But instead, the silence stretched one beat longer, and in that stillness, the waitress found her moment. The room leaned in, breathless, waiting for the words that everyone knew were coming. They didn't know what she would say, but they knew it would matter. They knew it would strike harder than any shout. They knew this silence was not defeat, it was the gathering of power. And when she finally spoke, she would not raise her voice. She would not need to. Because the silence had already given her words the strength of thunder. The restaurant was still frozen in silence. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied, believing he had crushed the spirit of the young black waitress standing before him. His laughter had echoed across the room, sharp and arrogant, and now the silence that followed felt to him like victory. But it wasn't victory. It was the deep breath before the storm. The waitress lifted her eyes. Her hands were still folded calmly in front of her. Her posture straight, her face steady. She did not tremble. She did not break. She simply stood. With a quiet strength that made even the guests lean forward in their seats, everyone felt that something was about to happen. The billionaire smirked, sipping his water, tapping his fingers loudly on the table. "Well, a tea," said mockingly. "Nothing to say." "That's what I thought. You people never do." And then the silence broke. The waitress took a single step closer to the table, her voice calm but clear. Her words cut through the room, sharper than any shout. "Respect," she said softly. But every ear in the restaurant heard her. "Respect is served freely, sir, not bought with money." The words fell like a hammer. The restaurant gasped. Guests turned to each other, eyes wide. Some covered their mouths, others straightened. In their chairs, the simplicity of the sentence made it more powerful. It was calm, not loud, measured, not angry, and yet it pierced deeper than any insult could. The billionaire froze. His smirk vanished. His fingers stopped tapping. For the first time that evening, he had no words. His mouth opened slightly, as if to reply, but nothing came out. The arrogance that filled him moments ago collapsed under the weight of a truth he could not deny. The guests erupted into applause. It started at one table, then spread across the room. A slow clap that grew louder, stronger, until the entire restaurant was filled with the sound of hands coming together. Guests stood from their seats, cheering. Their voices rose with admiration. "Well said." "That's right." "Bravo." The energy of the room shifted completely. The mother who had earlier shielded her child from his shouting now smiled through tears, whispering, "She's a queen." A man at the corner table nodded firmly. "That's the strongest thing I've heard in years." Even the staff, who had been frozen in fear, now stood taller, their faces glowing with pride for their colleague. The waitress did not smile. She did not bow. She simply remained calm, her eyes steady, her posture firm. She had not spoken for applause. She had not spoken for approval. She had spoken because dignity demanded it. The billionaire's face turned red, his jaw clenched. He looked around the room, but everywhere he turned, he saw disapproval. He saw guests standing against him. He saw the waitress standing taller than him without raising her voice. And for the first time in a long time, he felt small. He slammed his glass back onto the table, but the sound was drowned by the clapping. His voice tried to rise, but the cheers overpowered it. His power built on money, arrogance. and noise was useless against the force of dignity and truth. The manager stood frozen at the back, torn between fear of the billionaire and pride for the waitress. His lips moved as though he wanted to scold her, but even he knew the moment had shifted. The guests would not allow it. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. The billionaire leaned forward, glaring at the waitress. His voice finally broke through, low and harsh. "Do you know who I am?" The waitress met his gaze without fear. Her voice remained calm. "Yes, sir," she said. "I know exactly who you are, and that doesn't change what I said." The room erupted again, louder than before. Guests stomped their feet, clapped harder, cheered with pride. It was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been disrespected. Everyone who had been treated as less because of their job, their background, their skin. The billionaire sat back, his face pale beneath the anger. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his glass again. He was no longer in control of the room. The power had shifted, not to wealth, not to arrogance, but to dignity. The waitress stood calmly as the applause rolled around her. She did not bow, she did not cry. She simply turned her head slightly. Scanning the room, she saw the smiles of strangers, the pride in their eyes, the admiration in their applause, but she also saw the truth. The billionaire had been silenced. Not by anger, but by one sentence. Respect is served freely, not bought with money, and in that single line, she had reminded everyone of something they had forgotten, that character is greater than wealth. That dignity is louder than arrogance. That silence can hold more power than shouting. The billionaire remained seated, his pride shattered, his power gone. He had come into the restaurant believing money made him untouchable, but he was leaving with the taste of humility on his tongue. The waitress quietly excused herself, turning away from the table. Her steps were calm, her head held high. She did not need to say more. Her words had already shaken the room. Her silence now was the seal on the lesson she had delivered. And the guest, still applauding, still cheering, would carry her words long after the night ended. The sentence still echoed in the air like a bell ringing long after it had been struck. Respect is served freely, sir, not bought with money. The words were calm, but their impact shook the entire room. The billionaire sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his smirk gone. His eyes darted around the restaurant, but everywhere he looked, he met disapproving stares. The silence after her words lasted only a second before it was shattered not by his voice, but by applause. One guest began clapping slowly, then another, and soon the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. The sound filled the restaurant like a wave, rolling over every corner. Glasses rattled, tables shook, and the billionaire's face flushed red under the weight of it. Guests stood from their seats, clapping harder, cheering. Some shouted words of encouragement. "Well said." "That's right. Bravo." A woman near the front raised her glass high and called out to the waitress, and a chorus of agreement followed. The air was no longer heavy, it was alive with admiration and pride. The waitress stood still, her posture calm, her face steady. She didn't bow or bask in the applause. She didn't smile proudly or soak in the praise. She simply stood as she had stood all evening, with quiet dignity. She had spoken her truth, and now the truth spoke for itself. The billionaire shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, but the sound was drowned by the clapping. He tried to clear his throat to speak, but his voice cracked slightly, and the cheers only grew louder. His power, once unshakable, was crumbling before his eyes. For the first time that night, he looked small. The guests leaned toward each other, whispering fiercely. She silenced him. One man said, shaking his head in amazement, "Did you hear that? One sentence and he's finished." Another woman added, Money doesn't mean a thing when you have no respect. The staff, too, began to shift. Waiters who had stood frozen in fear now looked at the waitress with admiration. Chefs peeked from the kitchen door, their faces glowing with pride. Even the busboys, usually ignored, smiled to themselves. The moment belonged not to the billionaire, but to her, the manager, standing in the corner. Wiped sweat from his forehead. He had been terrified of offending the billionaire, terrified of losing his patronage, but now, even he couldn't deny what he was seeing. The guests weren't on the billionaire's side, they were against him. If he defended the man, the restaurant's reputation would collapse. If he defended his waitress, he might lose one customer, but he would keep the respect of many. The billionaire slammed his glass onto the table. Desperate to reclaim control, enough. He barked. His voice boomed, but it no longer carried the same power. The applause continued. Some guests laughed at his attempt to shout over them. A man in the back called out, "You've had enough already," and laughter rippled through. The crowd, the billionaire's face turned crimson. His jaw clenched. His wealth had always been his weapon, his shield, his voice, but in this room, at this moment, none of it mattered. He was just a man who had been humbled in front of strangers. The waitress finally moved. She gave a small nod to the guests, acknowledging their support, then turned her gaze back to the billionaire. Her eyes calm, her voice steady. "Would you like me to bring your bill now, sir?" The simplicity of her words was devastating. She had reduced the man who believed he owned the room to nothing more than a paying customer. A ripple of laughter and cheers followed her question. Guests clapped even harder. Some even stood on their chairs, applauding wildly. The billionaire gritted his teeth. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his jacket for his wallet. He pulled out a thick wad of cash and tossed it onto the table. "Keep it," he muttered, trying to sound dismissive. But the gesture didn't impress anyone. It didn't restore his pride. If anything, it made him look weaker. The waitress glanced at the money, but did not touch it. She shook her head calmly. "We serve meals here, sir, not pity." Her words struck again, soft but sharp. The guests roared in approval. The applause thundered once more. The billionaire's hands tightened into fists, but he said nothing. The room had turned against him completely, and there was nothing he could do. He had entered the restaurant with arrogance, expecting fear and obedience, but he was leaving it humbled. Stripped of the illusion that money gave him respect, the applause eventually faded, replaced by quiet murmurs. Guests shook their heads, some still smiling, others still in awe. The waitress stepped back, her dignity intact, her silence now heavier than any words could ever be. The billionaire sat alone at his table, his pride in pieces. The very people he had expected to admire him now looked at him with disgust. His power had vanished the moment she spoke that single sentence. And the reaction, the applause, the cheers, the respect was not just for her words, but for what they represented. It was a reminder to everyone in the room that no amount of wealth could ever buy character. That arrogance would always collapse in the face of dignity. The billionaire had shouted with the voice of money, but the waitress had spoken with the voice of truth, and truth had won.